The recurring theme among their an awkward term that refers to both self-discovery and socialization more than any actual discussion about philosophy. It also advertised a meeting for newcomers on Saturday at 3 p.m. Apparently Brad and Aaron groaned at the notion, assuming that it would be a boring seminar about the importance of purpose in life with some phony spirituality and hand-holding thrown in. So they were ambivalent about wasting a precious Saturday afternoon. But Frank was impossible to dissuade and they eventually yielded. I have been doing paperwork and menial tasks in a law firm of considerable prestige, and they pay me a pittance for it. I'm mostly doing it to have experience once I graduate, of course. The point is that on my way to work I've passed by the new Patricians building several times. It's pretty easy to miss, an eggshell white, 3-story building flanked by smaller structures on both sides, with little movement and no more than 5 or 6 cars parked outside at any given time. Then again, if this really was some sort of kooky cult I wouldn't have expected anything more flamboyant. Apparently the 3 guys arrived there 15 minutes in advance. Frank parked his dad's car a block away. The place was particularly lively on that afternoon. On their way in they were greeted by mostly middle-aged, middle to high-class people wearing loud sweaters, white button-up shirts or sports team t-shirts, invariably. That's exactly how Aaron described it to me. I remember because I found it pretty hilarious, since Aaron isn't usually the one to be passing judgment on fashion. The guys were lead into the central building along with 30 more people or so, most of them older. Apparently they got the occasional odd stare for being students. To their surprise, the back door of the building opened to a spacious patio surrounded by tall brick walls. The place seems to be quite a bit bigger than it looks from the outside, and Aaron says he heard some talk about a basement as well. They were herded as a group to the center of the patio, standing before a platform with a podium on top. There were small tents set up on both sides of the area with members waiting behind counters. One of them had a coffee machine and the other gave out yet more information in the form of pamphlets and flyers. There was also merch. Frank apparently bought a shirt, which seems very much like him. The ensuing wait was very much like sitting around, waiting for a concert to start, and the 3 took cover from the sun by sitting against a far wall. There was a lot of indistinguishable chatter among older members of New Patricians. All in all, Aaron says that there must have been some 300 people managing the event, which is a pretty surprising turnout, I guess. By the time someone stepped up to the podium, the afternoon was starting to cool off and the guys rejoined the crowd. Many of them were now wearing New Patricians shirts. Frank was delighted and put his on as well. Aaron noticed that something weird happened as soon as he did. The other members seemed to suddenly and abruptly recognize his existence, as if before he had been a ghost drifting among them. An elderly woman placed a hand on his shoulder for support. He exchanged amicable glances with many of the younger members, who must have been in their late 20s, according to Aaron's recollection. The 2 remained at the fringe, observing with morbid curiosity. The man who took the podium had an air of regality about him, apparently, a silvery but full head of hair and a well-trimmed mustache. He wore a brown blazer and exhibited perfect poise. Brad says that he had seen this man before in the paper. Apparently he's the Minister of Agriculture, or something. For university students, I have to admit that we are not the most politically aware. The next part of the story was not elaborated on by Aaron because he said it was boring. Basically, the man proceeded to give a rousing, elegant and ultimately meaningless speech on the value of the human soul and the mission statement of New Patricians, which lasted for about 45 minutes. There was periodic clapping in between statements, which turned into wild cheering towards the end. People were grabbing Frank by the shoulder and using him to prop themselves up and cheer, apparently. Frank, always the one to humor people like that, cheered right along with them, and so progressed the afternoon. Brad and Aaron considered ditching Frank for fun while they could still make it out the front door without the stampede of followers rushing out at the same time. But ultimately they stayed, and according to Aaron, they managed to pick up some interesting bits in the man's speech. Mostly they were peculiar because they didn't make much sense. Apparently the man spoke of a precise dimensional measurement of human potential, the ignoble spirit of charity, the spiritual value of inanimate objects in our daily life, and a new age of adoration for the human spirit and holistic creativity. If you've ever gone to one of these New Age meetings for whatever reason, such baseless phrasing probably doesn't seem strange to you, as it's a pretty common tactic for charismatic leaders. But Aaron says that as the speech went on there was this weird feeling in their air, not the typical blind devotion of a fanatical cult, but a sort of intensity in the looks of everyone there. Aaron and Brad started to feel like they didn't belong and were being made aware of the fact, so they retreated into the building and decided to wander around for a while until the whole thing was over and Frank could give them a ride home. They snooped around for a while without anyone interfering, although the secretary at the front desk gave them a strange look a few times. Mostly they browsed the bulletin board, which had a schedule for upcoming events, all of which seemed to be seminars of a similar nature. They had strange names, though, such as, Conference on the Latest Developments in the Study of Homeopathic Interlinking with Our Animal Friends. That's the only one that Aaron managed to recite from memory. By this point I think that the two had concluded that New Patricians was just another silly pseudo-cult for people lacking direction in their lives. The seminar finally ended amid cheering and clapping, and the mass of followers stormed back into the building and towards the front exit. Brad and Aaron waited for Frank to appear. He emerged, still wearing his New Patricians t-shirt, with a mischievous glint in his eye. Aaron said. He told them to go back to the car because he had to show them something. Now a block away from the building and in the safety of the car, which apparently still stunk of weed from the last hotboxing session in the park, Frank revealed the fruits of his labor, a small, black matte box padded with foam on the inside, housing an egg. According to Aaron, it was a little bigger than a chicken egg but had the same shape and hue. Frank explained that at the end of the seminar all of the newcomers had lined up in a queue in front of one of the lady assistants, who took out a large Chinese box and started handing out these eggs, one per person. There was no confusion or inquiry regarding the eggs. Apparently everyone understood that this was a thing that would happen at the end of the conference. Frank wasn't the one to give up an opportunity for something as strange as that and received an egg of his own. According to Aaron, Frank is keeping the egg in a cardboard box in his room, making sure that it is warm. I don't think that Frank knows how to properly care for an egg, or anything else that is or will become a living being. It's been 4 days since their little adventure at New Patricians and it hasn't hatched or changed in any perceptible way. This afternoon I'm going to stop by his house and see it for myself. Brad says that it looks like a snake egg, and that he saw a mural in the far back depicting a vivid green serpent. I don't think they plan on returning. Before leaving, the secretary asked them for names, phone numbers and email at the next seminar, but they gave out fake info. I'm not sure of what to make of all this at the moment. I'm going to ask around to see if anyone knows anything about this whole New Patricians business. Frank's house is a wonderful disaster. His father collects things obsessively. Sensible things, like records, encyclopedias, nostalgic trinkets from decades we weren't alive in, and also useless things, Halloween masks, kitschy holiday decorations, burned out remains of fireworks of New Year's past, pop culture detritus. He cannot let go of anything. Fortunately he is rich, as far as we can tell, and lives in a stately, old house with statues on the garden that look like creatures out of a painting by Hieronymus Bosch, a pool that is never filled, iron bars covering windows overgrown with brittle vines. It's spacious and empty. It's located next to that one terrain that used to be a school until the late 80s. The first time I went there I had to ask a nearby watchman for directions. I gave him the address. He said there was no such house. Half an hour of walking later, I found it. I was 2 years into my university studies at this point. I was bored and resentful at my parents for having encouraged me to choose this career path, so every week I skipped class more often. It reminded me of high school as so many other things do. There were policemen making lazy morning rounds around the neighborhood and housewives in sweatpants walking their dogs. Everyone else was working, studying or doing something allegedly useful with their time. The weather was gray and crisp. Pushing the gate open and letting loose some dust in the process, I had to wander around the house and yell out for Frank. I had figured I might as well stop by and see the much discussed egg for myself. I walked into the living room to find him. Surprisingly, with X, they were playing an old record that I didn't recognize and sitting across from each other, cross-legged, staring intently at a cardboard box in between them with a lamp hanging over them. I took a guess at what was inside. When I said hello, X didn't respond. He probably hadn't noticed my presence yet, which I was accustomed to, while Frank was cordial as ever. He said that X had another disagreement with his brother and headed over here for the time being. I wondered what that last part exactly meant. I crouched and peered into the box, feeling a bit silly between the two. We were alone in the house. His father was gone pretending to work. He was one of those people who, due to the nature of his position, could easily never stop by the office again and keep getting checks in the mail for the rest of his life. Only a few strident birds interrupted us. I reached out to hold the egg, but X brusquely stopped me. The hue was a bit off for a chicken. It was a little bigger and leaner, more elliptical. I lightly placed a fingertip on it. It was terribly warm. After a minute or so of just sitting there, Frank explained that the egg had remained the same ever since he received it 3 days ago at the New Patricians rally. He didn't really know about incubation, but figured he was doing a good enough job. Frank has a high opinion of himself. X interrupted to add, in his charmingly unique way, that the egg was important and crucial to something, and he had mostly come over here to check on it and made sure it was developing well. I didn't know whether to believe him.
We can prove a connection.
He rambled on.
We can show the rest that they are linked to the group. The group that took Erica's father's house. He had touched upon a subject that not everyone was comfortable with.
Wasn't her dad in a sort of charity society?
Frank asked. X denied this. He assured us that the clan is not only a charity association, or a club of rich old men, and much less an inoffensive new age deal like the patricians are supposed to be. It was infinitely more than that.
I think it's going to be one of the nobles.
He muttered. There was a silence then. For the first time that day I noticed that he reeked of alcohol.
Nobles?
Frank arched an eyebrow. X stared at us like we had just asked him what 1 + 1 was. He stared at us long and deep, as if he were going to reveal a particularly difficult secret. Sometimes it was hard to see his eyes underneath the unruly hair. He suddenly sprung up and started asking for a piece of paper. We couldn't find anything that hadn't been written on. So Frank ripped a page from one of his father's documents and let X go to town with it. He madly scribbled with a pencil sharpened and resharpened to the point that it was only a few centimeters long, which he produced from his back pocket. He kept erasing parts of the drawing for no reason and it only made things more muddled. Then he handed us the drawing. He pointed at each of the drawings and stammered to say something about them.
Nobles. Reptiles like snakes. Crawlers. Virgins. Pretty birds. Waterfowl. Guardians. Rats. But really, all rodents. Legion. Bugs. Spiders.
Then he pointed at the last drawing on the bottom.
No, bad, dogs, they hate them. The clan hates them. I don't know.
I studied the picture for a moment. 5 animals with exotic names. So you're saying this is what the clan is about?
I don't know what the clan is about.
He snapped back. This was after he was assaulted at the park. He said he just knew it had something to do with them. He suggested that perhaps it was all just a joke. Frank arched an eyebrow and asked him where he got that from.
The fuck's at the park?
He replied nonchalantly. Apparently he had pieced it together from that encounter and a number of other incidents, like the hotel, the bathhouse and the dumpster. Everything in the notebooks. It was his pet theory, I guess. He said he wasn't sure about the names but he was sure about the pictures. He then crumpled up the paper and handed it to me. Practically pushed it into my hand as if he wanted nothing to do with it. I said nothing, quietly unfolded it and put it in one of my school books. I made a mental note to tell Brad about this and maybe store it in the notebooks. X grew silent after that. We tried to coax him into revealing more, assuming that he knew something else, but he just stared intently at the egg and ignored us. My legs grew numb and I asked Frank if I could go out for a cigarette. He accompanied me. We sat on the lawn chairs by the empty pool, dirty and covered in webs. I stared off into space, something very easy to do when the sky is painfully monochrome, as if it were a screen draped over the neighborhood. Frank smoked in silence. I asked him if X was staying at his house now. He figured as much, he replied after a few moments of apparently mulling it over. He added that he didn't want X to go back home at the moment because he needed someone to take care of the egg while he was off carrying out errands or working part-time jobs. I asked him if that was what he was doing now that he wasn't in university anymore. He nodded slowly. He said his father had more or less given up on interacting with him beyond the common courtesies of hello, goodbye and please pass the salt. He just sent him off on errands that he was too lazy to do. He was set to deliver a package in District 11 tomorrow. I looked at him with a tinge of sadness. Frank's ambition had deflated. He used to do so many things back in school, and excelled at most of them. But back then we all had a future. The future then arrives and is completely foreign to your expectations, so you do something like that, but then we heard yelling from inside the house. It was X. When we got back and we saw him holding the cardboard box above his head as Frank's dog leapt up and tried to swipe it off his hands, barking and growling.